start. So good morning, wherever you are, and welcome. My name is Jacqueline Philpott, and I am the Executive Director of the Association of Film Commissioners International, otherwise known as AFCI. It's great to see some of our members on this call and some new faces too. And for those of you who may not be aware, AFCI was established in the United States in 1975 and grew to become a global membership organisation with film commissions at its heart. We are the only organisation in the world that trains film commissions, and AFCI undertakes a number of other key activities related to global events and activations at festivals, film markets, research, insights, and we provide guidance for emerging regions looking to set up an office. With our 50th anniversary approaching us in 2025 and a new strategy released last year, we are in transformation mode, welcoming new members into the organisation to bring our industry closer to our film commissions in their regions. We appreciate all of you taking the time to be on this call from all over the world today. The following presentation is a collaboration between AFCI and Olsberg SPI and a much needed update to an existing 2019 report released on best practices in screen sector development. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the team at Olsberg SPI for undertaking the significant piece of work and to Netflix for their support. Without this collaboration, it wouldn't be possible to bring this to you today. Before I hand it over to Jonathan from Olsberg, a couple of housekeeping items. This is being recorded, so it can be made available on our website within 24 hours to watch or share to any of your colleagues at a later date. Feel free to ask us questions in the chat, and we can ensure there is time at the end for questions also. And if you have any further queries after the call about AFCI or Olsberg SPI, Olsberg are willing to do more presentations for your organisation or other colleagues. I'm going to put some details in the chat once Jonathan gets started. Alrighty, let's get this show on the road. Again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much, Jacqueline. Hello, everybody. It's great to see so many friendly faces and also to be meeting some new folks. We're very grateful you've taken the time to attend this. So I'm Jonathan Olsberg. I'm the founder and exec chair of SPI, but I've got with me, and I'm going to hand over to two important colleagues, our Managing Director, Leon Ford, and our consultant, Kaylee Hughes. Kaylee really wrangled this project together as primary author and editor, and Leon oversaw the entire delivery of this particular report. So enough from me. I'm going to hand over to them to take you through this deck.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone, and welcome. So we're going to give you a bit of a speed run through what is quite a lengthy, but really detailed and important study. So I'll start with a little bit of information about the study. We'll give a little bit of background and industry context, a little bit more about the methodology for the study before we launch into the key findings, which will include the 7 research areas that we looked at for this report, and about 4 case study examples as well that are summarized. So as Jack and Jonathan mentioned, this is an update to a report that we first produced in 2019 in collaboration with AFCI. It is an update and expansion on that study. So it looks at now 7 areas: production incentives, workforce capacity, infrastructure, film friendliness, diversity, equity and inclusion, sustainability, and partner engagement. And those last 3 are the new research areas. And it's available in 2 formats. The first is the full report, which is just shy of 120 pages. It has a detailed chapter on each of those research areas that looks at the key findings, considerations, examples of ineffective practice, as well as 19 case studies throughout the report, and a couple of other chapters with some industry context and impact analysis, and then quite a comprehensive bibliography as well of some relevant studies, reports and other key research sources. And then in addition to that, we have the key findings summary report, which is a shorter 60-page document that primarily focuses on the key findings and tries to keep it shorter in more of a summary and visual format. And this document has been translated or is made available in 11 languages. so including English, another 10 languages. And both of these reports, we have a link and QR code at the end of this presentation, but Jacqueline would have already included a link in the chat by now, I think. And it's also available on both the AFCI and Olsberg SBI websites. So I'll pass over to Leon for the industry context slides.
Yeah, thanks, Kaylee. And just to, before we jump into the findings for you, just to reflect on the context that we were undertaking this work in. And as has been mentioned, we first published a best practice in screen sector development report in association with AFCI in 2019. And the industry obviously was in a very different place 5 years ago. You'll be familiar with the data on the right, which is from FX Networks, looking at original scripted series and the very large upturn in volume of series produced in the US from 2012 to 2023. And obviously, at the point of the first time we did this study in 2019, there was a lot of growth in the market. And obviously, since then, we've seen quite a number of headwinds hit our sector, including COVID, of course, and the contraction in spending by some content investors. Also, the expansion in interest, primarily initially, certainly on feature film and series, but now there's a lot more interest in live action, live events, as we've seen with the Netflix boxing on Saturday, and the rise in advertising supported models and the increase in commercials that everybody's expecting to be linked to that. So, and then of course the impacts of the US strikes as well. And generally, thinking about some macroeconomic factors such as cost inflation in many of the world's economies as well. So it's a very different picture 5 years on, and it's a much more complex picture as well that we're all existing in. So moving to the next slide, this is a bit of a reflection on using some data from Empire to look at projected content spend to 2028. And as I've explained, we've seen a huge increase in that spend in recent years, and many of those investors are now looking to rationalize and foreground profitability. But that said, there's still a lot of growth on a global level. According to this Ampere data, that's not so much in the North American market itself, but certainly in emerging regions of the world where there are, large cohorts of emerging consumers, thinking about Central South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Eastern Europe, the Asia Pacific, the Middle East and North Africa, all regions with a lot of potential growth in the coming years. So there is absolutely sort of global growth to be had, but complexity at regional levels, including in North America. So just a final word on context and turning to the issue of production incentives. As everyone on this call will be aware, North America, the US and Canada, has a very established mix of, major incentives, major markets that have a high amount of volume, typically thinking of provinces or states like British Columbia, California, Georgia, New York, Ontario. And what we've seen in recent years is an increase and a deepening of the incentive offer in North America. And you'll see some data on these bar charts on screen. Here are the number or the volume of incentives that we track through our Global Incentives Index. And we're up to about 39 US states and 13 Canadian provinces at the moment. So it's fair to say that legislators have absolutely understood that these incentive models can play a very significant economic and strategic role in sectoral development. I think that said, we are seeing some pushback from some legislators. You will have seen the news in Louisiana about the certainly the proposals to sunset that incentive there. It's it's not definite that that will happen, but obviously there is some legislative resistance in some places to these incentives. But certainly, as you'll see from later in the deck, these remain completely key in sectoral development, and linking to what we were saying earlier about the much more complex industry landscape we're now operating in. You know, there's a laser focus on cost, and against the backdrop of cost inflation, incentives, you know, become very, very much more central to development. Kaylee.
Yes, so just a couple of points about our methodology. As mentioned, we looked at these 7 different research areas for this study, and all 7 are standalone, but also interrelated. The development of one will impact the development on another, and are critical for the development of the screen sector. And from our perspective, a successful production market is one that has a really cohesive ecosystem that delivers across these 7 areas, and also is considers how these different areas impact their particular location. In this presentation, we're not going to go into detail about ineffective practice, but that is something that's looked at in the report. And that is looking at certain practices or processes that are in place that might inhibit or limit the ability to develop and expand the screen sector in a region or in a jurisdiction. And we sort of go into quite a bit of detail about how those can be, some of those ineffective practices can be alleviated. We also, throughout the report, look at both formal and informal interventions. So formal interventions are things like legislation, the film laws or the incentive laws that are in place, as well as the guidelines and strategies. And then alongside that are the informal, the processes, procedures, initiatives, all of the other pieces that enable those formal interventions to work seamlessly. And so a strong sector will be one that balances both formal and informal interventions, and are reviewed and assessed regularly to make sure that they're continuing to be effective and relevant and responding to what can be quite quick changes in sectoral needs in this industry. And then we'll be looking at 4 case studies throughout the key findings portion of this presentation, but we had 19 included in the full report from around the world and from a mix of emerging and more established markets. These were developed in coordination and collaboration with a number of producers and other industry contacts that we have, as well as other inputs, to try and find the best case examples of interventions related to these 7 research areas. But of course, they're only a drop in the bucket, and there are a lot of other case study examples that could be included, and in some cases are included throughout the report, just not as standalone case studies. And as with the rest of this key findings section, this will be quite a high level overview about these case studies and about these research areas, but the full report goes into a lot more detail, explaining exactly what those interventions are and the impact that they've had. So I'll pass over to Leon for the first few key finding research areas.
Thanks, Kaylee. So we're going to run through the 7 sort of key areas of the document, and as Kelly says, it's a very large, detailed piece of work, and we're really picking out some initial threads here. So if you haven't had a look at the study yet, please do, because there's a lot more information and depth on the points we'll be making. But you know, it's no surprise we're starting with production incentives. You know, in our view, these if used correctly can be very, very flexible, highly effective tools in developing a screen production sector, and that's reflected in how widespread they are at this point. we today actually are publishing our Global Incentives Index, which we publish twice a year and provides a guide to country, state, and provincial automatic incentives. And then there are now 120 separate models in that index, which do download it from our website if you'd like to access that. And really these models, these systems are very critical for supporting production. I've talked a bit about the cost inflation we've seen and some of the challenges in the sector financially. You know, incentives play an absolutely key role for many types of productions. And I think one of the key findings, you know, sitting across the issue of incentives is that they are critical both for inward investment and also for, you know, national or independent type of production. And in our view, the successful development of a production sector involves healthy development in both of those production types. And that's partly because they're so interrelated. You know, an independent or a national sector can develop very high level talent and skills and crew that can then make a jurisdiction more competitive for the inward. And then the inward side also helps provide revenue streams for crew and work for crew at different points in the year. So I think a healthy sector has healthy growth in both. And I think it's, you know, that holds true for incentives as well, having models that are flexible and sit across both. I think a few points about areas of best practice, and as Kaylee was saying earlier, we consider this in terms of, you know, formal approaches, so guidelines and legislation, but also informal approaches, things like the day-to-day administration of incentives. And I think a key point across both of those areas is the reduction of uncertainty. This is a sector that has a high amount of risk involved, financial risk, and, you know, adding risk through an incentive is just not, you know, is not usable for producers. These incentives to function well have to be certain and have to provide stability in terms of delivering what the producer expects them to deliver. You know, obviously, while retaining the need for checks and balances on the administrator side. Process speed is another key issue that comes up a lot in our work for producers, but also in designing incentives. And given the increased cost of borrowing in recent years, you know, it's really important for the competitiveness of an incentive that they are processed and administered, you know, at a fast enough pace to allow for necessary checks and balances, of course, but also in a way that isn't going to cost the producer by having to wait for months, if not years, for payment or a tax credit certificate. I've mentioned the point about applicability to domestic producers. I think moving on, we talk in the study about budgets and caps, and obviously not every system is able to offer an uncapped incentive, which is in some ways best practice because there's no limitation or uncertainty for producers. But where there are annual budget caps or budget restrictions, it's about making sure, you know, best practice is about making sure these limitations are clear to producers, and also finding ways to use those caps so that the money available is used or is implemented in the most effective way it can be. So we see, for example, some systems have a first come, first served approach, and that can work. But in some instances, that serves to, you know, there might be a very high value production that isn't able to access any incentive funding and will go to a different jurisdiction. So having a mechanism by which, even with a incentive cap, the system is able to prioritize higher value productions is certainly an area of best practice. Uplifts, we've seen a definite trend towards the expansion of uplifts offered by systems. And again, this links to what I was saying earlier about the flexibility of incentives as policy tools. And these can also work. They can absolutely be examples of best practice and have helped some jurisdictions address some of the key challenges of the sector, like encouraging diverse hiring or making sure productions, are encouraged to move out of hubs, for example, to make sure impact hits other parts of a jurisdiction. I think the finding here is that uplifts also have to be carefully considered so that they can deliver on their strategic aims and make sure that that the ask to producers is achievable, that the strategic aim can be delivered by the productions that are being asked to deliver that. And then finally, effective value. Some incentives can be marketed at a certain rate, but then once the producer budgets for that jurisdiction and takes into account things like non-eligibility of ATL perhaps, or different areas of disqualification, the effective value can be quite significantly less than the marketed value. And again, I think here it's about not over-promising to producers and being realistic about what the value is, particularly in the current climate where there is so much focus on cost and inflation. So moving on to infrastructure, which is the second area I'll talk about before handing back to Kaylee. As Kaylee said, just to underline the fact that these 7 areas are all interrelated. We're not suggesting that the introduction of an incentive alone can fast track development of a sector. It's all about the interplay and the sort of cogent development of each of these areas together and at the right time that leads to best practice or sustainable development. And I think the key finding regarding infrastructure is timing, and often a studio build is considered to be a short circuit to almost creating an active and thriving screen sector, and that's very, very often not the case. It has to be, the investment in a studio has to be very, very considered and to be undertaken at the right time in a sector's development so that there is enough throughput of production to deliver on that investment in infrastructure, and also that there are enough crews and people working in the sector that they can adequately service the type of productions that will be attracted to use a studio facility. And I think the converse of that is thinking about pop-up or converted infrastructure, where we've seen many jurisdictions be able to build and develop their sectors with converted infrastructure alone, certainly in sort of early mid stages of development, using non-specialist space to almost prove the use case of the sector and the needs of the sector, so that purpose-built infrastructure can then be built. And thinking about at that point when the sector is thriving, the sector is developing, and there is a case for infrastructure, I think we've called it non-financial support here, but what we really mean is the actions of public authorities. And again, public authorities do invest in film production infrastructure, but often they can play more of a developmental role in helping the private sector see the benefits of the opportunities provided by the production sector, and can also offer other types of support like fast tracking planning permission requirements in a jurisdiction. So I think the role of the public sector can be very effective in this space, but isn't always just about investing in bricks and mortar. And then finally, on environmental sustainability, this is a fairly obvious thing to say, but this is absolutely critical and should be a part of any piece of infrastructure, whether it's a conversion or a purpose-built space. The sustainability of that development should be a consideration from day one, and we'll return to this point on the sustainability section.
Right. So in terms of workforce capacity, this is an area that's been quite critical in recent years, especially post-pandemic, when there was the quite large boom of production globally, and a lot of markets was noticing a real pinch point in terms of crew capacity. And so there are 4 key areas of best practice. The first is targeted intervention and the importance of that. And so that is making sure that whatever intervention is introduced, whether that's a workforce strategy, particular training programs or initiatives, that it is taking the particular jurisdiction, the state or local area into consideration in terms of what it's offering and what it's delivering. So there are very different needs depending on the location. There may be overlap, but making sure that it is targeted is important. So if there is an issue in terms of that entry level talent pipeline, making sure that that's a focus in that workforce intervention. If there are key roles that seem to be particularly difficult to fill in an area, that's another thing that could be focused on in this sort of intervention, but making sure that it is really bespoke to the particular location and isn't taking too general an approach in what it's trying to deliver. And then another important area is around aligning training with industry and need. And we've found this to be particularly an issue with any roles that involve technology, whether that's VFX, animation, editing, sound engineers, but where there can be quite a gap in terms of what's being offered at universities or colleges or training programs, and then what's actually needed in the industry. And so there can be a misalignment in the programs that people are taught in, or even to the level of skill that they're trained in versus what they would need in an entry-level role. And that's also true for the non-tech roles as well. So it's important to make sure that whatever training is being implemented, that what the realities of working in the industry require is also part of that. And a key takeaway of that is that any training should be regularly reviewed and updated just to make sure that it is aligning with any changes in the industry. And then another consideration is around cohesive strategies. So this is about making sure that whatever strategy is implemented is drawing from a number of different sources, connecting with both public and private partners, industry, training providers, governments, and ensuring that the workforce delivers what's needed for that particular location, but also that it's tapping into industry need, into wider training objectives in the state or the city or jurisdiction, and that it is taking that full holistic view of training for the area. And then finally is perhaps one of the most important, and that's comprehensive data collection, making sure that this is built into any interventions, that training data about the those being trained is being collected, but then also that there is an effort made to continue to track as people step into their careers, so that you can understand whether those training interventions and programs are working, if there are adjustments needed, if there are certain people that the training isn't reaching or isn't being effective for. But the more comprehensive and the more complete that data is, the better it's and the easier it's going to be to develop those targeted interventions, targeting those key roles or key grades or wherever it may be that needs that really clear focus and engagement. And that's also when we go to diversity in a second, will also be another important area. Excuse me. So we have the first case study of the presentation, and this one is from New Mexico in the US, particularly looking at the range of training provision resources from the New Mexico Film Office. We focused in this case study on their offer around the below the line crew, but this is just a particular segment of the work that they do rather than encompassing all training and development opportunities that the Film Office takes care of. So under the Film Office, there are a range of different programs, including the Economic development job training incentives program, the film crew advancement program, and also Operation Soundstage and a number of others. And these are all really comprehensive programs that focus on different segments of the industry and different priorities in terms of whether that's around workforce development for new entrants or people that are making that transition out of formal education into the industry, whether it's about finding new pathways in for veterans in the case of Operation Soundstage, or potentially advancements. So helping people take that next step once they're already in the industry to a mid-level or senior level career, and making sure that they have the support and training and development they need to really build those opportunities. And then tied to that last slide around the 4 areas, I think one of the best things about New Mexico and what they do in training is that it is a really cohesive and comprehensive approach to training. So they work with a number of different partners. They look at different ways, whether that's through incentivizing participating companies to run training programs and to employ people on productions, as well as education providers and others. And this has enabled them to create a really strong pipeline of talent into the sector, which enables productions to continue. There's consistent work for crew, and you get that really smooth ability to have people have a really as strong and suitable a career as they can in the screen sector. And then this is also, as a result of these, this has had a ripple effect in terms of workforce development. So an increase and improvement in terms of technical and industry-ready skills, but also an increase in hourly wages for industry workers, which in 2023 was $35.51, which was a 21 increase from the rate in 2022. So that is the New Mexico case study. But as mentioned before, a lot more detail in the full report about all 4 of these areas, in terms of explaining exactly what they do and how that impact occurs. So moving on to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Just with an eye on time, I'll focus on 3 of these areas, but they're all in the full report. So as with workforce development, regular data collection is really important here, both in terms of understanding the effectiveness of any interventions that are introduced, making sure that those programs are meeting the objectives, meeting the goals, and having a sustained impact on whichever diverse group you may be trying to reach. And also that's continuing through their career. That is really important to gather as much of this data as possible, although it can be challenging to get some of this data. So that's also a consideration in terms of how best to approach gathering what regular data you can. Another important consideration here is around integration into workforce development. I think in the past, we often saw DEI incorporated midway through a workforce development strategy or towards the end, or maybe added to a strategy that had already been in operation for a few years. And while that can work, it won't necessarily be as effective as it could be if it's being considered from the start and is central to that initiative that's being introduced, and making sure that it is being considered across that workforce strategy or intervention. And then community engagement is the third one that I'll touch on tonight. And that is about making sure that whatever intervention or program or initiative that you're looking at, that you are drawing on the community, both during the development phase to make sure that the program under consideration is likely to be effective, that it's targeting the right areas and needs of those groups, but also community engagement is really important for getting the message out about these programs. We've done some work trying to attract new entrants from different backgrounds into the screen sector. And one of the things that we found in researching previous efforts is that sometimes these really excellent programs were being marketed in a way that just wasn't reaching the right audience and reaching the groups that it was targeting. So engaging with the community really helps to make sure that that message is getting out there. And also because it will be coming from community groups and organizations and education providers that are known to the different diverse groups, that there is also a level of trust and understanding included. So we move on to the second case study, which is looking at the Indigenous Screen Office in Canada. And this is an independent organisation that represents First Nations, Inuit and Métis storytellers in the Canadian screen sector. And they do a significant amount of work providing a different range of programs and initiatives that advocate for and fund Indigenous storytellers across Canada. We're in this case study on this slide, it's focusing a little bit more on their funding, but that's very much not the only or the most important element of what the ISO does in Canada. But in terms of some of the specifics, I think one of the core elements and things to take away from this is that the ISO really places the Indigenous storytellers at the centre of any of their initiatives and approaches and programs, and make sure that remains a key focus for whatever's being done, both in terms of the funding and the advocacy work. And another really important thing that the ISO does, and actually this was something that came up in quite a few of the other DEI case studies we looked at, was engaging in really strategic partnerships in order to maximize whatever their goals or objectives are. So connecting with industry, as in the case of the Indigenous Screenwriters Lab, which was a partnership between the ISO and Paramount Plus, or with other governments or other film offices and organizations to ensure that, in this case, that Indigenous participation, both nationally and internationally in the screen sector, is improving and growing. So as an example of some of the impact, in 2022, the ISO provided development funding for 50 different projects. They provided production funding for 37, and they supported 17 post-production marketing and distribution projects. They also provided travel funding to 87 Indigenous creators, and this funding was used so that they could attend festivals or networking opportunities at places like Berlin, at TIFF, Cannes, and a number of other festivals and markets, to further their careers or to further and support their productions that they were working on or had completed. And then for 2025, due to the work that the ISO have done and partnerships that they've developed, they'll have 37 million Canadian in annual funding to put towards their initiatives that benefit Indigenous storytellers and screen content. So just the final area for me before I pass back over to Leon is around sustainability. And this is one of the new areas for this report, and is still an emerging area in the screen sector. There's excellent work being done, but it's not necessarily being done consistently globally just yet. And hopefully this chapter will help people think about how they can integrate sustainability more consistently into screen production. So there are 6 areas, but I'll just touch on a few. And I think one of the most important is making sure that in sustainability, as with DEI, is integrated from the very start of production, that it's not an add-on halfway through or at the end to check boxes, or to meet sort of certain goals that a production feels they have to, but that it should be part of the planning and decision-making process. And really important in enabling that and normalizing the shift to sustainability practices is to make sure that productions are aware of what sustainable options they have. And film officers can play a really key role here in connecting vendors, local vendors with productions, making sure that any production is aware, especially if some of these vendors aren't necessarily screen specific. And if the studio perhaps hasn't shot in the location before, they might not be aware of what options they have. So making sure that everyone is fully understanding of the options available early in the process so that they can implement it from the start. And that will help to normalize that shift and build those new habits so that hopefully one day a lot of these decisions will be the first thought for productions. And then another important element is making sure that what sustainability requirements there are realistic and actionable for productions. So if there are certain green initiatives or incentives or requirements in place, that there are vendors available. And the case study we're about to look at in Vancouver is a really good example of making sure that something that is being implemented is thinking about the industry and where production is occurring. And then the final thing is just incentivizing change, which can be quite literally including a new uplift, like Leon mentioned in the incentive section, incentive uplifts around meeting certain green initiatives. But it can also be about promoting and acknowledging new vendors, good work being done by productions in terms of sustainability, new studios that have strong sustainable credentials, things like that that help to promote and help others recognize the sustainable practices and opportunities that there are. So as mentioned, the case study is in Vancouver in Canada. And this was an initiative between the City of Vancouver, Producing for the Planet, and Creative BC and other partners to unveil some clean energy kiosks. These are hydroelectric and part of the plan to remove a significant portion of the diesel generators that get used by the screen sector in Vancouver. So these are part of a wider initiative and sustainability objective in Vancouver. And part of the success, I think, that we'll see from these kiosks is tied to the fact that it's not a single initiative that's been unveiled, but part of a wider offer, which includes reducing permit costs by 50% for productions that use clean energy sources, which includes these kiosks and other elements. And then critically, I think the first 3 of these kiosks were placed at popular base camp parking areas near the downtown core, which is where 40% of the city's filming takes place. So they're accessible, they're close to where productions are occurring, which takes a lot, which is going to encourage productions to engage and choose these over diesel generators. And then the goal is that by 2023, that there will be a clean energy kiosk readily available close to the majority of filming locations in the city. And that would put the city on target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 33%. So that's a really significant impact, particularly as Vancouver is such a strong production hub that's a really excellent step in the right direction in terms of normalizing sustainable practices in screen production and making a really great example for the rest of the world about how this can work effectively. So, Leon, I'll pass back over to you for film friendliness.
Thanks, Kaylee. And so just moving to the final 2 areas of best practice from the study. The penultimate area is film friendliness. And as Kaylee was explaining earlier, in the study, we see a division between formal best practice and informal best practice. And again, film friendliness is one that leans more towards the informal side, but this is really about how a production jurisdiction, once a production lands, how that market can make life easy for that production and allow that production to deliver value, economic value without friction, without any issues that slow it down or make production difficult for that project. The first key finding here is that in order to do this, it's about building consensus. And what we mean by this is that key partners across a landscape in a jurisdiction understand that supporting film and television production is an important undertaking. It delivers value. And by key partners, we mean entities like police, permitting authorities, customs, immigration, and so on. And we'll come on to how that consensus is built on the final area, but certainly film friendliness is about making sure everybody understands why there is value in being film friendly. The access and understanding element to this is also key. Obviously, consensus is built on the understanding that there is value in being film friendly. And we see that in successful examples, certainly film commissions and film offices have a key role in bringing those service providers together, whether it be a permitting authority or a transport authority or whatever it might be, but ensuring there's understanding. And that can be done on a micro level with individuals, or it can also be done on a whole of sector level with information on the economic value of the sector, or positive news stories about what a production is delivering. Permit processes, linked to what I've just been saying, can be a real challenge in some jurisdictions, but just making sure that work is being done to improve these systems, as well as immigration, as I say, customs and other areas. And moving on to the next slide. So that's film friendliness. Linked to this is a new area really in the study, partner engagement. And what was clear to us in undertaking this work 5 years after first doing this sort of study is the realization that a lot of people, a lot of our clients are spending a lot more of their time thinking about partner engagement. And we're lucky in this sector in some ways, in that it's been very well recognized by some governments, the high amount of economic and strategic and cultural value that can be delivered, but not every jurisdiction is at that point. So that's where partner engagement comes in, the need to engage with key decision makers to help them understand why engaging in this sector, why supporting or investing in this sector is so critical. So if film friendliness is about the day-to-day areas of a landscape that interact with production, partner engagement is about the overall framework of legislation or government or governance in a sector, and thinking about how engaging with those points of governance can help drive and increase and improve the sector. And an obvious point to start, but identifying those key partners is absolutely critical. It's important in advocating for the sector or any sector that we understand who the decision makers are, and also linked to the point on the bottom left, what they're interested in terms of data. How do they make their decisions? If it's based on economic data, how do they evaluate that economic data? So really looking at how the screen production sector can be situated in a way that is comparable with other sectors. So finding ways to present data on the sector, and in many cases to develop data processing mechanisms for the sector that will enable comparable data to be put into government, so that those individuals in government or their advisors can understand the importance of investment. And that comes to the provision of evidence, which again is a very a very key element of best practice here. And many of the markets where governments are particularly cognizant of the value they're getting from investing in screen production are markets that have done a lot of work over the years to build out very robust data tracking systems for production and incentives. And obviously incentives provide a very good mechanism to gather data if done right. There is an exchange with the producer, and best practice absolutely is getting good data so that the success or otherwise of that incentive investment can be measured. So certainly provision of evidence is absolutely key. And then an interesting one to end here is the need sometimes to correct erroneous or negative assumptions about the sector. We can be in a very interesting place as a sector in that, we're extremely well known on a global level. Pretty much everyone has seen moving content. And yet, despite that, it's, the realities of the sector and how it operates and how projects move and how economic value is delivered is often not that well understood by some partners. And I think there is always a job to do to underline why this sector isn't just about the red carpet. It isn't just about celebrities. It's absolutely about manufacturing and about delivering day-to-day economic activity that hits a jurisdiction's economy in a very impactful way and can move around that economy in a very broad way. And I think one area of best practice in delivering that is about innovation. And, we're working in a highly innovative digital storytelling sector, and, finding ways to tell the story of our sector using those tools is something that definitely could be better harnessed to underline value. And then the final point is about repeat engagement. As we all know, there's a lot of churn in government. There's a lot of replacement, a lot of geopolitical and industry change. And I think this is a moving target, really. It's not something that can be delivered once. It's about constant repetition. It's about constantly having the data that can be updated and about constant communication. And this is true for all sectors of the economy, really, that the need to justify impacts and justify investments, which screen is absolutely a strong deliverer of those impacts. So just a final slide on this before we move to the final case study. This is just a bit of thinking around typical partners and typical ways we might delineate those types of partners. And what we've done here in this sort of spoke diagram, moving from the left, there's obviously central government and legislative, and that's about evidencing and convincing of the value of investment. And we look at entities like ministries, legislators, review committees, opposition, for example, people who are, legislators who are not in government. And also there's an interesting issue here with new legislators or freshman legislators coming in and the need to, as I say, repeat that engagement. The public authorities, again, this is about informing and building consensus and helping them understand why engaging in the sector in an administrative or logistical way is important. And then the private sector is also, a key partner to engage. And that can be, for example, about activation into the sector. If we're thinking about encouraging more bank lending against a credit or for independent projects, there can absolutely be a role in informing the private sector there. And, there's multiple other types of organizations that require engagement, from unions to the public to other types of trade organization. And then just the final slide of this deck is a short case study on the state of Illinois, where we've done some work on modeling the economic impact of the production services tax credit. Illinois is a really good example of strong partner engagement. There's a very active organization there, the Illinois Production Alliance. You know, the state has had a long history of content production and has built a very strong production sector, and organizations like IPA play a key role in bringing together key entities from across the production landscape, and, you know, underlining the support or the access or the ability they have to speak to legislators. The state governor visited Los Angeles in 2024. I think you know, and met with production decision makers. In terms of specifics of best practice, definitely the creation of the IPA and the bringing together of private sector partners, but also, you know, unions and other partners across the landscape was a key, you know, was a key step. And also having strong data, which is tracked by the Illinois Film Office, but being able to use that data to put together an economic impact study, as we did, to show the, you know, in Illinois' case, a very positive return on investment. And, you know, I think what we've been seeing in Illinois is, you know, strong private investment in studio development and strong interest from legislators. And that underlines, in terms of key lessons, the fact that stability is absolutely underpinned by high profile political support. You know, as I was saying right at the start of this session, the need to remove instability or uncertainty given the high financial stakes of film and television production. So absolutely getting to the point where there's legislative understanding and political support, but also the uniting of different types of partners. So union representatives, private sector business, legislators, you know, that can all be highly effective in building a sector. So I know we've talked a lot, and as I say, this is a really just scratching the surface of what is a very detailed resource that's available for free from AFCI on its website. And thanks again to Jacqueline and team for the collaboration on this. But thank you all. We really appreciate your joining us today, and we'd be very happy to answer any questions either now or on the chat function, or as a follow-up if you'd like to reach out directly. But thank you.
Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Kaylee and Jonathan, of course. And again, thanks to Netflix. Yeah, again, a call out for any questions if there is any. Otherwise, feel free to have a look in the chat for our contact details, and you can contact any of us direct